Hello, I'm your host, Matthew Wong, and here are my co-hosts. Introduce yourselves.
Some people say the name of the podcast, doofus.
I'll get to that eventually.
Okay,
Get
fine.
your ass moving.
Okay, I'm Jake, and I just want to, cut some things off before the comments potentially come and say I think Zack Snyder seems like a kind-hearted man, and he's the type of guy that I would love to just sit down and have like a drink and chat with.
I absolutely agree with you. Have you ever seen the video of the stand-up comedian that does crowd work and accidentally picks on Zack Snyder? It's so funny.
Oh, I saw that.
He goes, what do you do for a living? I direct films. What's your name? Zach? The guy goes, holy shit, wait. No, but I do think that he seems like a cool guy. But with that, I am another host, Jason, and at the advisory of Jake, I'm going to use a fun fact that he said would be a good fun fact, which is that I would rather scrape ice off of my car every day of my life if it meant I never had to deal with a humid, hot summer day again, because I hate sweating and I hate the heat.
I can agree with that.
And I also have overactive sweat glands, I guess. That might be TMI, but I don't give a fuck. It's my podcast.
He's an oily boy.
These are wonderful introductions, by the way.
I'm gonna ruin it. I'm Sean. I don't have a fun fact this time.
End it.
That's it. That's the end. I'm gone now. That's the end of the podcast. Goodbye, everyone.
Been good.
Jason, did you even introduce yourself?
He did say he's Sean and that he doesn't have a fun fact, and then
No, you. Did you introduce yourself?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I feel like Matt did not listen before me.
I was not listening then. All right. Anyway.
Brock Osweiler, dude.
Only Jason gets that.
Yeah, that's a joke that literally only the two of the hosts on this podcast and no one listening will understand. But there you go.
And with that, we are culturally illiterate. And as you can tell, we are professionals. We are the podcast that wastes hours of our lives watching bad movies and spends an hour or more talking about them as well. Thank you, Jake.
Some of them are good.
So, some of them were good, but the stinkers hurt.
The bad ones are really bad.
Anyway, we are going to be talking about Watchmen, specifically the Ultimate Cut, which was released on March 6, 2009. It is it is written by David Hayter. Metal Gear Solid
Snake.
shout out there. Snake.
God,
and then
what?
Alex Tiss.
David Hayter
don't know
is the
how
guy who plays Snake from Metal Gear Solid.
or used to.
And he wrote this
before
movie?
Hideo Kojima became
He also
Hollywood.
wrote one of the other movies we watched.
Yeah, he wrote X-Men.
That's funny.
He's incredible. Honestly, I wish I got his signature at Comic-Con.
He's got a
Anyway,
weird
moving
track
past
record.
That is a weird track record. I wrote Watchmen. I voiced Snake.
I wrote X-Men.
And I wrote X-Men as well.
By the way, Matt,
I think he wrote
looked
the
it up, and
second one,
I believe
too.
it's pronounced Suh.
Suh?
Alex
Excellent.
Suh.
Alex Suh. And of course, directed by Zack Snyder.
That was the best thing ever.
Okay. And shot by Larry Fong. It stars Malene Ackerman as Silk Spectre. Billy Crudup. I am horrible with pronunciations. As Dr. Manhattan. Matthew Good as Ozymandias. Jackie Earle Haley, I think that's how I pronounce it, is as Rorschach. Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the comedian. And Patrick Wilson as Night Owl. With the animated Black Freighter scenes voiced by Gerard Butler, which is still shocking to this very second. I still can't believe that's Gerard Butler. Anyway.
I can't tell if it was the way the audio cut off or how it was, but when Matt said Gerard Butler, it sounded like he said Drunk Butler.
Drunk Butler?
I was a fan of his pronunciation of Malin Ackerman.
Yeah, that was good.
I am not good with names.
Wait, real quick, Patrick Wilson,
You're
was
great,
he
bud.
in that
He's
fucking...
Ocean Master.
Okay. Was he in a different
also-
movie that I'm thinking of?
He's in
those
tons of horror
Conjuring
movies.
Hold
Yeah, he's
on.
in tons of
Dear.
horror movies.
Give me a second.
I mean, he's in movie. I don't...
He's in movies.
Let's all pause while Jason checks IMDb.
No, you don't have to,
All
but
right.
I'm going to
I'm going
do
to talk
that
about
on the
how...
side.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about Watchmen and how it's related to DC. So,
Moonfall.
Watchmen is published by DC Comics, but it does not exist in the DC universe, although it is now, and it's horrible. So don't read the comics. Those are horrible comics. But because the Watchmen grew so popular, DC basically said, "Oh my god, we have like a franchise in our hands and we want to make money off it now. And it doesn't matter if we basically destroy all of the characters and basically perform all kinds of character assassinations for both Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan. We will get these characters into the DC universe and we will sell merchandise of these characters." Okay, my rant's over. On to the plot.
By the way, real quick, Patrick Wilson was in the movie I was thinking of. It was Moonfall. Fuck that movie. It was a piece of shit.
Oh,
God
yeah.
The last 20 minutes are pretty fun, though.
I swear to God, I literally watched that whole movie, like, Watchmen I'm talking about, like, knowing it was Patrick Wilson and just not making the connection that I had seen his face in Moonfall, and then I right now just did, and it pissed me off, because I fucking hate that movie.
Before we get into
like
the plot,
so much Elon propaganda in it. Fuck Elon, too, while we're at it, cracker-ass bitch. Banned me on Twitter twice for calling him a
Anyway,
cracker.
before we get onto the plot, I want to give a shout out to Alan Moore, of course, the part-time genius and part-time lunatic. All right, now we can. What did you say?
And Dave Gibbons. Everything in this book is equally Dave Gibbons' creation.
I thought he was just the artist.
Yeah, buddy, that's it's
Exactly.
a collaborative
That
medium.
is about half the medium, man.
You know what? That's a good point. I apologize for my ignorance.
I thought he was just the artist. Correct.
Anyway, on to the plot. In 1985, a man living in a Manhattan apartment watches news about escalating Cold War tensions and response from five-term President Richard Nixon. Sorry, when an unknown
Nixon.
assailant attacks and hurls him to the street below. Throughout the opening credits, a montage reviews the rise of costume crime fighters from 1939 to 1977, accumulating in public backlash and the passage of Anti-Vigilante Act. It's really weird to see protesters asking for more cops. That was really weird to see. Anyway, Rorschach, a vigilante detective who operates illegally, discovers that the dead man was Edward Blake, better known as the Comedian, a costume hero who worked for the government. Suspecting that other vigilantes could be attacked, Rorschach warns members of his former team, the Watchmen. Rorschach's former partner, Dan, oh my god, Dreiberg? How do those words make those sounds? I don't get it. Anyway,
Letters.
Dan Dreiberg believes he is paranoid, but relays his concerns to Adrian
Adrian
Veidt, a crime fighter turned businessman. Rorschach later visits Dr. Manhattan, a physicist whose accidental superpowers make him a national security asset, but Manhattan is preoccupied with energy research and ignores him. So, what would you guys like to talk about?
The Richard Nixon makeup.
Yeah, first and foremost, I want to say they did a great job at depicting Nixon in that I wanted to beat his ass every time I saw him, and that's how I feel about Richard Nixon.
See, the
Nixon stuff is
thing
actually one of the
is,
first.
go ahead.
It's one of the first things I wanted to bring up to Jason, just because it is one of, it's not talked about, but Nixon being the president is one of my least favorite changes. Like this, we'll get into why I personally think this movie misses the point of the Watchmen comic, which again, read it. But one of the small changes that I think shows that is, and for context, I believe all three of the four of us have read Watchmen. Jason has not, so this is Jason's first exposure to Watchmen.
Correct.
In the comics, the president is not Nixon. It is Robert Redford, like the actor, who is
actor Robert Redford. He was in a Marvel movie, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was in Winter Soldier.
I thought so.
But he is meant as a parody of Ronald Reagan, same initials, also a former actor.
Right.
And he is used to mirror, like, a lot of the story of Watchmen is commentary on Reaganism and Reagan's America, and then you talk, like Matt brought up, like people protesting for more police and the mindset of the time for like the war on drugs, and things of that nature. I kind of think because of the fact that like pretty much everyone will shit on Nixon. Like maybe you'll find some contrarian here and there who's like, but what about this but like you're not really gonna like turn anyone away from shitting on Nixon. Obviously, there's a large contingent of people that are still like huge into Reagan, and I kind of feel like it was a really soft move to either not trust the audience to make the connection between Robert Redford and Ronald Reagan, or to not scare away that portion of the audience.
Yeah, I think well, for one, if I'm being a little pretentious here, I think that the initial artist clearly, that's very clearly an intentional thing put in there, as you stated. It's a clear parody or satirization of American politics at that time. So I think that's definitely a lot more poignant and impactful as a storytelling mechanism, and I think it one is important because it's an integral story part that the initial artist intended to put in, which is my pretentious side just saying you should respect the artist and what they intended. And then the other thing is that also I think it would have been far more impactful than just having Nixon. Because, as you said, everyone hates Nixon. If you make commentary on someone who's a little bit more divisive in that he has a lot of critics but also a lot of supporters still to this day, that's definitely, it creates more of a conversation, and art is intended to in some way make you think and make you converse about topics. So I don't, now that I know that was the initial thing, that kind of cheapens it more to me.
I do want to kind of piggyback off
Sorry,
what Jason
I kind of rambled
about.
there, but I hope any of that made sense.
That's fine. You were making good points, and I kind of like segues into what I want to talk about, and that what makes the original Watchmen comic so great is that it has a lot to say. And because of recent Marvel movies, I'm just so used to these vigilantes and superheroes being more of like a fantasy, right? Being more of like a good guy, bad guy, hero story. Basically just watching, something pretty admittedly shallow, even though I do enjoy them. But like rereading Watchmen, it made me think a lot. It made me think about the world. It honestly made me think about just how awful the world can be, but also just like the feelings I have are kind of hard to express. But the world of Watchmen is so multi-dimensional. It's so realistic because of how morally gray it is. I love how every single character is incredibly flawed. Like most of the main cast of Watchmen have either huge egos, are assholes, are narcissists, and that's not something you really get nowadays. Everything is like black and white, which ironically is what Rorschach sees the world. We'll get to that later. But the world of Watchmen is so three-dimensional. It feels so real. And seeing this world just come up alive through the pages, man, it just makes you feel something, right? Like for me, it made me feel kind of uncomfortable. But that is a feeling that I wish more like comic media would make me feel. Or not just media in general, like shows and stuff. Because when something has something to say, you think about it more and you remember it more. While even though I do watch, like, I'm going to keep ragging on Marvel movies even though I like them, but like after I watch like Spider-Man Far From Home, I enjoyed my time. I liked the movie, but admittedly I don't think about it much after I leave the theater. But that's all I need to say.
Yeah, I also while you were talking, another point on the Robert Redford Ronald Reagan subbing for Richard Nixon thing. Okay. I also think it's also more representative of one of the core themes of like the rich elites that the movie kind of has so so clearly throughout, because historically, regardless of where you stand politically, historically Ronald Reagan and his policies and political ideology is very tied to, in art, representing the rich elites and elite and capitalist, high-end capitalists have controlling society in to some extent.
Gotcha.
So that it also takes away in that regard.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Like it's like he is, and I from like listening to punk bands all the time, like fucking punk bands in the 80s and shit, their posters and all that were always like Reagan with X's on his eyes and shit. Like that, he's very representative of that core theme.
I want to add, I have two things. One is one we didn't really get to talk about, but like the intro of this movie is one of the things that I actually do genuinely enjoy.
Yes,
just beautiful.
Just about to say,
to a beautiful tune.
If anything, one of the reasons to me that it kind of works so well, is that one, it taking Bob Dylan's song and putting that over the intro of this, showing historically how superheroes have changed, history over time and how that's kind of affected things going forward. It's just an interesting way to introduce the movie. But then on top of that, by using that song, a song that it is a little bit older, but also instills a lot of, at least from the comics, in comparison to the comics, which is going to happen a lot. But like in comparison to the comics, another one of the themes is like nostalgia and how we see that and how negative nostalgia can be to our own perception of reality. And the way that intro brings it in with a song that's talking about America, but in to a degree, a negative light, while going through the history of superheroes and how they've impacted America as a whole and how they've impacted the political landscape. In terms of the movie, I think is like comparing that to the comic book is like a really good choice. It goes downhill afterwards, but if I wanted to make a comparison, but like that's one of the things that I do have to give the movie like incredible props for, is that like it does handle that like in a good way when you think about it from that perspective of an adaptation. But one of the things that I do want to bring up too, that I feel like can start with just the beginning of this movie as a whole, is that like it still like. The one thing that I love in comparison to the comic is that, like, it's putting these superheroes, or these costume vigilantes, in roles where they're put into the real world, in essence, and are goofy and out of place. They all look goofy and out of place, and the whole entire thing is that it's really goofy that superheroes exist. Just the inherent idea of them in the real world is kind of a little goofy thought, and it juxtaposes against that realistic world, especially when you have characters that are these superheroes that feel real, that are flawed. And then you have the movie where it does have those flaws and tries to put them in like a real world, but instead of like making them kind of juxtapose against the real world, they instead make the whole film gritty, which it just doesn't work with the movie. And it kind of, in one way, it just that's one way that the movie goes against like the themes of the comic book. And as an adaptation, I should kind of I want to see those themes come to light in an adaptation. It feels kind of weird looking back at this movie and seeing that like the original Watchmen was kind of was a parody of superheroes, and this one seems to like revel in superheroes, if that makes sense. So it really, right from the start, we kind of get the idea of that being like a weird way of this movie not understanding the themes of the comic that it is adapting.
Yeah, to me, to your point there, I felt very much like an air of like it seemed like they were being represented as like almost like Greek god-esque, where like they were doing some questionable moral things, but like they were the high elite people, so it doesn't really matter because they're helping also, so fuck it, whatever.
Yeah, that's a Zack Snyderism right there. But I do want to piggyback on what Sean was talking about how the beginning was a very, very beautiful montage of nostalgia and the harms of nostalgia. I also love how in the opening montage, how it's basically like watching like the rise and fall of like a Silver Age hero, because the poses they were doing at the beginning just seemed like cheesy, like I don't know what age, like so similar to like a Adam West Batman, where they're just giving like big toothy smiles while holding guns, and then they're giving like a stereotypical punches to criminals and watching them being put down, and then watching all that just eventually deteriorate as, you know, vigilantes are outlawed. It was very interesting to watch, and I'm going to give Zack Snyder a compliment, and that this was all beautifully shot. He is a great visionary, and I will never ever say he isn't, because that's just straight up lying and hating. And yes, you want to say something?
Keep going. Keep going.
Okay.
You're done.
I was almost over anyway. But yeah, basically he knows how to shoot a scene, and he knows how to make a shot look pretty. And honestly, he will always have my respect for being good at that, at least. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One, I totally agree. I think say what you will about like his movies, but I think like at a pure like technical and craft level, like Zack Snyder's as good as they come. Really, like the guy clearly knows what he's doing, whether you like it or not. And I'm saying that as someone who largely is very mixed at best on a favorable day about his work. And I mean, I think talking about the nostalgia stuff that you guys all hit on really shows why the story of Watchmen is timeless. Because even just isolating that one theme, which is like in the grand scope of the story is potentially a minor one, is still so rich. Because you look at today, like in the modern political landscape, and where people are still throwing around "Make America Great Again." And Alan Moore is a British man. To be honest, I'm not sure if Dave Gibbons is. But if anyone knows that, let me know. But the Watchmen story is still very American. And I think that comes from more still working in America a lot, and with American companies a lot. But you talk about things like looking back at what is it like. That like rose-colored glasses nostalgia. Well, when was America great? Because that's a very privileged point of view if you're coming from an area where like I'm saying that as someone who has a lot of privileges in life, who comes from like who I am a biological, like, you know, I identify as the gender I had at birth. I'm a man. I'm white. I come from a well enough off background financially. I've been in a heterosexual relationship since I was 14. So I'm sure maybe there was things that weren't necessarily bad for me back in the 80s, back in the 60s, back in whatever, but that's not necessarily the case for pretty much any other group of people. And that's something that was, I mean, you're talking about a book that 40 plus years down the line is still super relevant. And then the last thing, and we can cut this bit out if y'all don't fuck with it, but I kind of wanted to just pitch, like, I feel like we're going to have a lot of really free-flowing conversation here. I wanted to pitch to all of you and to Matt, if you want to just, do you think it'd be a good idea to just, like, burn through the whole plot and then just have an open discussion?
Yeah, because I also have...
Sure, I'll read through it right now.
More thoughts on
I feel like Watchmen is too dense of a story to not include the plot, but we're having such good combo that I don't want to keep interrupting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to just burn through... And it all it's a non-linear story, too, so I feel like it'll be easier this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does make sense, because I feel like what we want to talk about is basically comparing the movie and the comic book, because they are so similar. I was reading the comic as I was watching the movie just to see how similar it was, and it was almost word for word the same movie. It's same movie and comic. It was like as if David Hayter just got lazy and just copy pasted the entire Watchmen script and put it in a movie script. It was word for word, almost exactly like Watchmen, which is baffling. Because despite being so similar to the comic book,
quick, Dave Gibbons
it is so
English.
different, and it doesn't get what the comic book was saying. So it blows your mind. Okay, I'm not going to get into that now. I'm just going to blow through the story. So
thank you, Jason. I thought so, but I wasn't positive.
At Blake's funeral, Manhattan, Vert, and Dryburgh each recall the comedian's pessimism in his later years about the Watchmen's mission. After the service, a lone mourner pays his respects. Rorschach tracks down and questions the mourner, former supervillain Edgar Jacoby, aka Molac. Jacoby asks that Blake has recently broken into his apartment while he was sleeping, tearful, unmasked, and incoherent. Rorschach is astonished, but doubts that Jacoby would tell a lie so bizarre. During a press interview with Dr. Manhattan, an investigative journalist tells him that several people who have been in contact with Manhattan have developed cancer, including his former girlfriend. As other reporters mob Manhattan with questions, he snaps and exiles himself to Mars. Alone, Manhattan reflects on his existence and his regrets at being turned into a weapon. In his absence, the Warsaw Pact countries make aggressive moves, and Nixon prepares for war. Vert survives an assassination attempt, suggesting that Rorschach's mass killer theory is correct. Dreiberg takes Laurie Jupiter, a second-generation vigilante and estranged friend of Manhattan, for protection. Rorschach's investigation of the assassins, leads him back to Jacoby. While attempting to question him again, Rorschach is framed for his murder, arrested, and unmasked as a low-born vagrant?
Yeah, vagrant.
He's a dirty hobo. Anyway, in prison, Rorschach defends his vigilantism, to a psychiatrist, saying that he cannot ignore evil and the people who cause it. Dreiberg and Jupiter, growing nostalgic for their crime-fighting days, put on their costumes and break Rorschach out of prison. Manhattan teleports Jupiter to Mars while Dreiberg joins Rorschach's investigation of the Blake murder. Evidence points him to Vert as the mastermind. They find him in the Antarctic hideout where he had just overseen activation of Dr. Manhattan's energy reactors in New York City and other locations across the planet. On Mars, Jupiter tries to convince Manhattan that humanity is worth saving, and succeeds only when he learns that Jupiter is Blake's illegitimate daughter, a fact so unlikely that it restores his respect for life. Vert admits orchestrating Manhattan's exile, staging the assassination, framing Rorschach, and killing Blake, who was spying on his activities. He also executed the final step of his plan, turning the world against Manhattan by rigging his reactors to explode, killing 15 million people. Manhattan's return with Jupiter to a devastated New York pieces together that what has happened and teleports to Vert's hideout. After a brief struggle, Vert shows him that the countries of the New World have put aside their rivalries to focus on the common enemy. Realizing the logic of Vert's plan, the Watchmen agreed to keep his secret with the exception of Rorschach. Please edit out, Jake. Who Manhattan's reluctancy kills. Who Manhattan reluctantly kills to preserve the new global peace. Manhattan departs permanently from another galaxy while Dreiberg rebukes Vert's moral sacrifice, and Jupiter finally comes to terms with her parentage. A New York tabloid editor, disgusted that there is no war to report on, tells a fellow journalist to grab something from a box of crank submissions that contains Rorschach's journal. And that's it for the plot.
Not to be that guy, but I'm absolutely going to be that guy because I have to say it. It's Vite.
Vite? Well, you're going to deal with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's too late now, and I wasn't going to interrupt you while you were reading. But
Matt, you need to re-record the entire plot.
No, we don't have time for that.
Run it back.
I can run it back. I have no problem.
Oh my god, no.
No, absolutely not. There's so much to talk about.
I want to add one comment that kind of relates back to what I said in the beginning too about the nostalgia thing, and then I'll never talk about that again. The one thing that I don't think got mentioned in the plot was Hollis Mason and his death.
Oh yes,
the original
right.
Night Owl.
Oh yeah, good catch.
Which he dies after being attacked by some random thugs that enter into his house that are looking for the current Night Owl, and he gets beaten. One of the things that I think is like the biggest difference to see that really highlights like what you see is like a difference between the movie adaptation and the comic book itself. And especially you see it with like the fight scenes. This kind of applies to a lot of it, and that like inherently in the comic there aren't really a lot of fight scenes at all, and even then when there are fight scenes they're very one and done and very brutal. But when it comes to the movie, they have extended fight scenes. They're very choreographed. There's a lot going on in them. They're very flashy and very cool, which is great. But it kind of goes against what the comic is saying a little bit, and it is one of the ways that it's noticeable when it comes to like nostalgia and the way that it so negatively impacts the ways that we see and perceive the world, is that when Hollis Mason is being beat to death and he's dying, in the comic book, he doesn't throw a single punch. He's murdered, and the only things that are flashing before his eyes are those moments of him when he was a superhero and him remembering all the deeds that he's done and all the good things that happened while he was a hero. The same similar situation happens during the movie, but he's throwing punches at the same time. The entire point being that, like, the only thing in the comic that he's remembering about his life are all the good deeds he did as a superhero, and it's looking back on the fact that that's the only thing he can remember is something that's fairly negative. Whereas in the way that they look at it in the movie, it takes a very positive stance by showing him punching and fighting back against these thugs in his last moments, and that he's remembering all of these heroic elements of his life, seeing that he's dying as a hero and not just an old dude retired in a home. It does kind of go against the whole, like, it's framing in the comics as nostalgia being something that is negative to our perception, while in the movie it's seeing nostalgia as something that's more positive and should be seen in a more positive light. And it's one way that, like, again, like, the movie goes against what the comic is trying to say there, and that's just a small thing. That's one of the smaller details that I thought was genuinely interesting, is it's something that's so small and something you don't really notice or think about, but just the way that it's framed, it takes away a lot from what the comic is trying to say versus, you know, the movie saying something really that's completely different. And a lot of what I take away from it is Zack Snyder's love for superheroes, which you really see throughout the rest of his movies, and his love for for heroes and their mythology and the way that they are like Greek gods. But that's not what Watchmen was really trying to say about superheroes, and so they're really clashing against each other in a lot of the ways that the movie is trying to adapt the comic book, and it just doesn't work.
So first and foremost, we already mentioned the intro, but I want to go a little deeper into it because I'm gonna mention other music used in the film as well. Because, like, so the intro with the Bob Dylan song is beautiful, love it just as much as you guys were gushing about it. I agree with everything you guys said, and I think it's especially great because obviously they use a Bob Dylan song he writes about topics that are similar to the themes in the film. So it's relevant, it's relatively simple and catchy song, and ultimately it's a folk song, which is perfect for that segment, because folk music is at its nature music for the common folk, for just regular people that is easy to sing, easy to perform. So it goes well with that because it provides that sense of just community and theme building while looking back on this retrospective. Now, Bob Dylan songs are used 3 times, and I think that that's very good because I like that because it's like a nice recurring theme and a nice little bookend as it goes. Because then the next time it's used is in the middle of the movie, Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix is a cover of a Bob Dylan song, and the credits song is Desolation Row by My Chemical Romance, another cover of a Bob Dylan song. So it's a nice little bookend for the film. Now, what am I trying to say? To go against that point, I suppose, there's other times where the music in this film, I think, is just, like, dreadfully on the nose in a way that it makes it feel out of place. Like, I can't remember the exact moment, but I know there's a part that 99 Red Balloons, which is another song that's about war and politics and geographical conflict and all that. and it's played and it just starts playing as soon as like there's a lot of graphic violence. I can't remember the exact scene though, and it just feels so like it feels like they just were like, oh, what's a song that talks about war? Let's put it in at this war part. And it's kind of going for the theme, but not really, because the actual scene is really glorifying this violence and making it seem like a positive, happy affair, and that these people are powerful and glorious. And then there's what?
I was going to say, to add on to your thing, there are moments where I think the music choices are actually really good and are meant to like reference things. I don't know if anybody noticed this choice, but like for example, during the scene where they show Dr. Manhattan being the reason that America wins against Vietnam in the Vietnam War, the song that they're playing during that moment, which I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it's the same one that plays during Apocalypse Now when they first start fighting in Vietnam. So, like, interesting pop culture references are abound in this one that I think are, like...
Sorry, can I interject? Because I actually hate that needle drop.
It's like, I'm not saying I like it by any means. I think there's a reason behind it, I should say.
Yeah, well, I just mean, like, but it's called Ride of the Valkyrie.
That's what
and,
it
like,
is.
The comparison, real quick, is just, like, in Apocalypse Now, it's used to, like, hype up these soldiers, basically, and just, again, like, not to keep comparing one thing to another, because it's also possible to talk about this movie on its own, and I'll get to that later. But like in comparison, that's what so like the context of that scene is it's playing as like what Dr. Manhattan is thinking about at the comedian's funeral, versus in the comic. And this scene is still showed in the movie, but without this previous thing. In the comic, it is the scene of the comedian murdering a woman that is pregnant with his child in Vietnam. And it is, and again, like Sean was talking about earlier, the paneling in the 9-grid style, which again, I'll have a whole spiel about later, is so cold and objective and shows the disconnect between Manhattan and humanity. And that objectivity, versus you have a wildly subjective shot of like Manhattan looking like a literal god with Ride of the Valkyrie playing, is just so like feels so wildly out of character for Manhattan.
The other terrible needle drop that I wanted to mention is when Patrick Wilson says that the comedian is dead, and as if it is a 2007 YouTube meme, The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel starts playing, and it is like just so cringe to me. It's another one where I feel like they were just like, oh, what's the saddest start?
Yeah, it's
kind of
similar to how the Suicide Squad
their
songs
is dead, and then threw in.
It was just so shallow, you know what I mean? Right? And it's kind of just like someone who's making like
That's
a
YouTube
or TikTok music video would play.
It's the type of thing that like,
you know what I'm trying to say?
100, like,
it's so shallow
from like 2007, 2008, where like I don't know, someone fucking like stubs their toe, and then The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel plays, and that's exactly what they did.
I'm pretty sure like Zack
movie.
Snyder
like,
or whoever was in charge of composing this film just looked at the titles of these songs and just thought to themselves, oh, that would be great in this scene, right?
It's like, okay, yeah, that song is a sad song that's talking about like death and depression and whatever, sure, but like it's such a like stark drop. Like he's like the scene ends and it's just like, hello darkness, and it's like, what the fuck? Of all song, like you couldn't have like don't even have a song, just have like violins play or some shit.
I know, which is such a letdown like, because of the beginning montage and the like, Bob Dylan song. I'm like, okay, this is like, not that bad. It's actually really, really good. And then they start playing, I forgot what the song called, something at the Valkyries, while Manhattan is fucking this exploding, exploding Viet Congs.
Really
it's
did
so inappropriate.
He's just, like making Vietnam explode, and I'm just like, this really makes me feel like America was the good guys in Vietnam, which I don't think is the truth, but I don't personally believe that, but that's what this scene is making me feel like I should believe. Like it made it feel like I don't know,
Yeah.
made
All
Vietnam
right.
feel like
Wait.
a great, glorious war that needed to happen. When really, it was just like America shoving its dick where it shouldn't
Wait,
go.
Jason.
It also just kind of takes
Like that,
away
it
from like the
really
seriousness of
truly
that
bothered
situation.
me.
It
Yeah,
also
it
kind of
really
goes back to
seemed
like
it
at
was
the
making
time
light of
what
it
people
and
thought of
and
like the
making it
Vietnam War
seem
and how
like
it basically
positive.
was like one of the most embarrassing
So they went
wars
and killed a
the
bunch
United
of
States has
innocent
ever fought
people
in
and
because
then lost.
they didn't fight it for good reasons. Exactly. Exactly. They had no good reason to fight that war. They basically sent troops totally unprepared for what they were going to go through in freaking jungles. They lost in embarrassing fashion. And so it just kind of reflects, the thinking of the time of having this gigantic godlike creature to be on your side. And that kind of like, alteration of history should be met with something with, I don't know. It should. It's not the song that they picked, where it just kind of seemed like, oh, look at Dr. Manhattan, he's exploding Asian people now. It's just kind of what the song expresses to me, personally.
Speaking of this, Jason, do you have more songs you want to
No.
bring up? Because there is one that
Not
I
that I
cannot
can think of.
believe has really.
Maybe when you
in
bring
my
it up,
mind, the worst needle drop I have ever heard in anything, all time, bar none, is paired with the worst sex scene that
I've
ever
God.
seen in
I'm
anything,
sorry.
all
Yeah, no,
time,
fuck that.
bar none.
Yeah. Oh my God.
When Night Owl can finally keep an erection
First
after
of
beating
all,
up poor
that
people
disgusted
and
me.
has sex with Silk Spectre, which again, similar to the
Oh my
violence, because
God.
this is a really weird, fucked up thing, and commentary on like the sort of selfish nature that even like Night Owl, who's one of the like sort of more altruistic one of these people, sorta needs to go beat people
First
up in a
of all,
costume
like,
to be able to
with the
get his
first
dick hard.
part, when he like
It's, like,
was
also
having
framed
erectile
really-
dysfunction, I was so uncomfortable because it was like just seemed so out of place, and I was like, is this supposed to be comedic? Is this supposed to be like sympathetic? What is the tone here? I don't know. I don't like it either way. And then, like you said, he beats up poor people, and he's like, "Oh, now I am rock hard."
I guess
And
you
it's
could,
like,
he also does
shut the
save some
fuck
people
up,
from
though.
a
I
fire,
don't
but
care.
like, come on.
It's not good.
I
And
mean,
then it's not even like
I'm gonna
they shouldn't
one
have
second.
used that version of it either, because it's like if you're gonna use that song,
Hallelujah.
there are much more sensual performances.
It gets worse. You
I
guys need to
guess.
let me finish because it gets worse, and it's something I don't know if y'all know. So again, it's different in the comic because it is framed so objectively, so it just comes across as very pathetic the whole time. Whereas the movie does not uses very subjective framing, so it completely changes that. Hence, I think Jason's confusion on how am I supposed to feel about this. But the other context,
Sorry.
and again, please let me finish because this actually gets sort of serious and important for a second. No, I don't mean about that. I'm just prefacing before I really get into it. So, if anyone also may know, that when the first trailer for Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League came out, Hallelujah was used as the trailer song, which, in my opinion, is actually a much better use, especially for the greater context that I'm about to get into. Hallelujah is Zack Snyder's daughter's favorite song. So first of all, real quick, before we get into the heavy stuff, why'd you pick your daughter's favorite song for that really weird sex scene, buddy? That is absolutely hilarious to me. Now, before we kind of deconstruct more, I do want to acknowledge, so unfortunately that is, for anyone who doesn't know, Zack Snyder has several children, and that daughter, unfortunately, Autumn, killed herself. She committed suicide, and Snyder is like a huge advocate for suicide prevention and has like done a really, really admirable, amazing job of rallying like the fandom that's around him to raise money, specifically for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, afsp.org. So like I kind of don't want to like bring up something. I don't want to make light of that song and the connection between him and his daughter. And I definitely want to shout that out because that is so important. But on a lighter note, in like the 2009 mindset of that how it didn't come out, it just makes it more of a baffling choice. That like, what?
Yeah, I don't know. It, like I said, it just made me uncomfortable. The scene, without take away that song in it, the scene still made me uncomfortable. The song
I want to
paired
talk
with it,
about.
I think,
I'm going
made
to
me more
rewind it a bit,
uncomfortable.
so I'm not going to get into
It
negatives
wasn't
yet.
good, and
I
don't
do
know
want to talk
what else
about
to say
how,
about that.
despite how I feel about this movie, it is very well shot, and I do admire how Zack Snyder, in his own way, basically brought Watchmen to the big screen, and basically tried to keep it as faithful in his own way to the comic as much as possible. Like, you can take several frames from the comic and you can line them up exactly when they happen in the movie, and they look almost exactly the same, but in a movie instead of a comic. But the point stands, as in Zack Snyder did try. He's a great visionary director, but he was a horrible choice as a director for Watchmen, because the thing is about Zack Snyder is his films is like watching a kid play with action figures is the best way I can describe his movies. Things just have to look pretty. Action has to be, flamboyant, right? Well choreographed, well shot. It has to be slow motion. And violence in a lot of aspects in this movie is romanticized. Now, that is a huge problem, because that doesn't work for Watchmen. Strangely enough, in my opinion, I think the comic book is less violent than the movie. But I didn't think that at first until I reread the comic. It is because the violence in the comic is more impactful because of just how the word's not realistic, but horrifying it is. It's not pretty to look at.
It's very brutal.
It's honestly awful. It's brutal. Exactly. That's the exact word I wanted to say. Thank you, Sean. It's brutal. It's really hard to look at. And Zack Snyder just doesn't get that. In fact, it's too overly violent. And a perfect catalyst for everything I'm saying right now is how he treats Rorschach. I feel like Rorschach is extremely glorified in this movie. From the way he is shot to how much the movie focuses on him and doesn't focus on his flaws. Like, a perfect example of that is they cut out one of my favorite parts of the comic, which is his therapy sessions with Malcolm Long. They kept it so simplified, and they didn't show the interactions that the comic books do. And the reason why I am upset for why they simplified it is because those therapy sessions with Rorschach and Malcolm, they really show you what an awful person Rorschach is, because they give you a just deep insight onto his psyche and just show you what a messed up person he is. A perfect example is how they depict the story of when they found when Rorschach found the murdered girl in the movie compared to in the comics. In the movie, when he confronts the girl's killer, he takes a butcher's knife and starts turning his head into mashed potatoes. Now, that is violent, right? And you can even say that's karma. But it is not nearly as brutal as what Rorschach does in the comic. In the comic, he simply arrests him to the furnace and just listens to what he has to say. And all he does is take some gasoline, pour gasoline all over the apartment, and set the whole thing on fire and just watch the whole thing unfold. Now, the result is the same, as in he kills the serial killer, but one just shows you just a violent act, right? While in the comics, it literally shows Rorschach, and what I see is him burning who he was and his outlook on life to the ground, because that is essentially what happened. And how it's treated in the comic is seen as a moment where there is no curing Rorschach. He is permanently scarred, and he's just insane. There's no quote unquote curing him. While in the movie, it's more glorified. They make it a point. They use that scene to show what a badass he is. And another example of that is the line, I'm not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with me. In the comic, it was just what are those boxes called? Where there's just like thought bubbles but in boxes? What are those called in comics? It's not a thought bubble.
I mean, I get what you're saying, though. It's just it's often used for narration, but it can be like
just
internal
like inner
monologue,
Okay.
like,
Oh yeah.
all of a sudden, I'm blanking.
It's
on the
like a
technical
narration
term, but-
box.
Yeah,
Gotcha. It's like a narration
yeah.
box. So Malcolm Lima has a narration box of this exact scene that was depicted in the movie. And in that scenario, it just seemed like Rorschach was like a rabid animal, right? It was just like not a throwaway line, but it wasn't glorified in any sense. It was told by Malcolm's point of view. And when you read that, you're just thinking to yourself, this guy's crazy. But in the movie, they show you Rorschach doing it. And the way they shot
It's
it,
so calculated.
the way they depicted it in the movie, is so calculated. It makes him seem like,
I
don't
felt
know, they
like
just
it was
want to make him look
supposed to be
badass.
unpredictable,
And
but
that's
it wasn't
not-
unpredictable.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's like
I do
they
wanna know
show
what you
the
mean.
fryer grease and
They basically make him like a calculated superhero,
yeah,
right?
and
That's
it
just the
makes it
problem
seem
with this
more
movie.
like he's
Is that
defending himself
Rorschach
and not
in
like
the
he's
comic
an insane
is an
person that
awful
just threw
person.
fryer grease
He is,
to
yeah,
someone's face.
he is an incredibly
That's-
violent person. He is incredibly sexist. He reads right-wing propaganda, which is said in the comic book. He's not a good person. He's a horrible person. And this guy, right, he has a black and white view of the world, which doesn't work. He lives in a morally gray world. But because of that, he hates everyone, well, almost everyone in the movie. He calls women whores, and he sees just like criminals on the street as scum. He is a despicable human being. And the way he is in the comics makes sense, right? As in, he is a realistic depiction of what Batman will be, which is what he's based on. There is no way a character like Batman will have any kind of healthy social life or any kind of relationship of any kind. More in a more realistic sense, he's more likely to be Rorschach, just a loser, a homeless conspiracy theorist, shut in. Yes, a crazy person. That is a more realistic version of what Batman is. But in the movie, he's portrayed to be more like Batman than Rorschach.
I will
and that's
say,
all I gotta say for now.
Yeah,
Jason,
I
you
laughed
say what
out
you want to
loud
say.
when he said possible.
Oh god,
homosexuality.
that's one of the
Need
things.
further
Walking down the street.
investigation.
That is one of the things I absolutely hate that this movie does. And there's a specific reason why in the comics he does it, but it's made out to be like Rorschach's homophobic. But one of the things that they do, and this makes me really uncomfortable, in that they try to make Rorschach seem like he's morally superior in the movie, is that when they hack into when they hack into Veidt's computer, there is a folder on the computer for boys that is inherently meant to be received as he has photos on his computer of naked men, and therefore Rorschach's correct.
So
he's
it's
gay.
like it kind of vindicates him.
I
somehow.
hate that.
And
that is such a dumb thing.
That's true, and you're right. And I also had another point that was like, so I like we've said, I've never read the comic, so I don't know how he's characterized there. But in this movie, he felt a little like Holden Caulfield-esque, and I mean that in the sense that, like, it feels like they're trying to make me root for this guy that, when I look at him as a character, is just a piece of shit and that I don't like and don't want to root for. And like The Catcher in the Rye kind of does that with Holden Caulfield. It's like he's a little shit and you don't like him, but it tries to make you root for him, but you don't want to and you don't. And that's how I feel about Rorschach. It's like he's just an annoying piece of shit. And it feels like they're trying to make me root for him, and like they're trying to make it seem like he's like a flawed, decent guy, when in reality I'm watching him talk about how like this guy's gay for literally no reason and whatever, and all the other terrible things that he unhinged things that he does. I don't know.
There's a reason why the cult that takes after him in the HBO show, which I haven't seen yet. I do plan on seeing it one day.
We are going.
Well, the reason why
We are going to cover that eventually too.
Oh, cool. But back to what I was saying. So there is a reason why the cult in the show is just an extreme right-wing movement, and it's because for that exact reason is that Rorschach he's a right-wing lunatic, and this movie just does everything it can to try to justify his actions or make him seem more sympathetic.
Yeah, like I just really
and no matter how sympathetic,
I was getting like big, like unhinged Holden Caulfield vibes.
Yeah, and another perfect example of how this movie like puts Rorschach on a pedestal is the ending and how they handle his death. In the original comic, he's the only one who is opposed to Ozymandias' plan, and he goes and tries to basically go back and tell the world that this squid monster was all a big conspiracy, and Dr. Manhattan stops him. The major difference is that in the movie, Owlman's there to witness the whole thing, while in the comic book, it is just Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan. In the original comic... Yes?
Can we break down real quick, because you mentioned giant squid? I expect for both the audience...
Oh, yeah, okay. Let me finish my point.
Let me finish.
I really
Let me finish my point first, and then we can talk about the giant squid. Okay. So, basically, Rorschach wants to reveal the conspiracy to the entire world. And in the comic book, how it's handled is that it's just Manhattan confronting him. There's no Owlman to witness the whole thing. It's just a one-on-one. And Rorschach just has a brief conversation about how basically what's one more sacrifice to Dr. Manhattan, right? And he tells him to do it. Just kill him. And he rips his mask off, and it just shows him crying his eyes out. And it just shows you like what a horrible existence he lives. And I think Alan Moore says it best. He is a miserable man who wants to die, but he wants to die through his own twisted moral code. He wants to die his own terms. And it just shows you what a miserable and lonely man he actually is. While in the movie, they have Owlman mourn him and openly cry in pain when he dies, as if he's some kind of, like great friend to him. That's not who he is. The fact that, like, oh my god, it makes me so mad that they try to make him more sympathetic by showing his friend mourn him, even though this friend, all he does is leech off of him, break his locks, break into his apartment, steal his food. What good does he do? Right? Like, it doesn't make any goddamn sense.
Right, if you're gonna show them being friends,
it only makes sense if you want to make Rorschach more sympathetic. Yeah, it's not a well-established friendship. It doesn't make sense why Owlman would mourn him so much. Because we weren't shown anything. Any kind of like friendship moment, despite that like one moment in which Rorschach calls him a good friend, and Owlman just kind of reluctantly agrees. So that's another thing I have a problem with.
I love that.
Another big thing is what we're going to get to. Yeah,
even though that's a different character entirely.
I know. I'm ranting. I'm focusing too much on Rorschach. Damn, I am fighting.
Owlman is like a DC Comics character, like I
mean,
a DC
hey,
continuity.
Night Owl is also a DC Comics character, technically. I'm so tired. Anyway, let's talk about the giant squid that pisses me off still.
Yeah, what the fuck are you talking about?
So real quick, and Jason, do you remember the like weird cat thing that's in the movie for like 2 minutes?
The weird
at the end
thing.
He has Ozymandias at the end of the movie has this like high, like this like kind of
tiger.
like purple tiger, but with like really tall ears, like a lynx almost.
Yeah, it looks like a lynx cat.
He sends it after Manhattan. He uses it to like delay Manhattan. So in the comics, that thing's name is Babustus. It's around a lot more.
Babustus?
Babustus, yes. I believe that's the name. Maybe I'm mismaking, but I think it's Babustus.
No, it better be Babustus, dude.
So in the comic, he does not frame Manhattan for the killings. He creates a fake alien squid.
Babustus.
And blames that and blames that for the killings as the thing to unite the world around.
And then the alien Babustus all over New York.
I actually think it was a good change because the comic has time to like slow drip the reveal of that, because you see Babustus throughout the comic, and there's like little things about like there's these artists on Vight's payroll. That's weird. Oh, there's these genetic engineers, like, and like and it like makes sense. I don't really think you have like, as long as this movie is, there's still not really time to like
and then it probably would have been like another hour long.
Yeah, exactly. That he's like genetically engineered a fake space squid to frame it on. Like, it just doesn't like.
And I think that it's like compelling enough to be like, oh, throw it on Manhattan.
Yeah, like it's one of those things. Like, I think you could argue like, oh, but would the world actually believe that the U.S. didn't know? Like, would they just accuse the U.S. of a false flag? But I also think knowing how. But also, I think not knowing for sure how it would go is kind of part of the point of the story of Watchmen. So I give Snyder credit in that regard. And like I said, I just think it would kind of
no. That was
like,
actually like one of the things that I had no issue with. I thought that worked really well.
Yeah, okay. But that's what Matt talking about the giant squid. That's what he means.
I genuinely thought I missed something. I was like, I thought I paid pretty good attention to this film.
I think
I missed a squid.
I think the one thing that I disliked about the ending, and this is more just like, I think it works for the movie. I think the only thing I don't like is how bloodless it is in the movie versus the comic, I guess. And that is to show that like the comic is a lot more reserved at the way that it shows violence, and is very like, it only shows like how brutal things are when it comes down to it, that you have to. So like at the end, there are multiple panels of them just showing off the dead bodies and the blood spattering all across New York after the squid is dropped. After the squid Babustus is all over New York. But in the movie, it's fairly sterile, and you just get that there is a big explosion in all of these major cities, and that's it. You don't really see how destructive and impactful and terrifying that is, other than you seeing like the aftermath of we're no longer at war and everybody's at peace, which happens in the comics, of course. But like, the comic very much doesn't glorify the violence, and the movie does, to the point where it tries to make that a focal point of like how awesome this action is. And so like, I feel like no matter what, in any situation where the movie shows off that at the end, like that, the impact of something like that, it would come off less and less impactful just because of the way that the movie is shot and the way that the action is done. But in the comic, it's so much more impactful to see the destruction afterwards that I wish there was some way they could have replicated that in the film. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, what I want to talk about as well is more of an advantage of being a comic book than a movie, but I'm going to mention it anyway. The comic focuses a lot of time on these side characters, right? The newspaper guy, the boy who reads all the comic books, the Black Sabbath comic books. We also get to see Malcolm and his
Did you
wife.
say Black Sabbath?
I did say Black Sabbath. Shit.
Black Freighter?
Yeah, Freighter.
Black Sabbath?
Freighter?
I'm sorry, I'm tired. Anyway, his Black Freighter.
You mean Black Sabbath?
Shut your mouth.
Anyway. Black Sabbath. Shout out Ozzy Osbourne. Ozymandias. Oh, coincidence?
Yes.
Coincidence? I don't know.
Yeah, so the boy who reads Black Freighter, Malcolm Long, and his wife Grace, and there's probably other side characters that I'm forgetting. There definitely is. But we basically get to know who they are and grow to at least like them somewhat. So when the giant squid drops in the comics, we have the unfortunate opportunity to see all their dead corpses litter the streets of New York City. And it's horrible to look at, because you grow somewhat attached to these characters, and just to see them dead in the streets, being part of the thousands, millions of bodies that are now litter New York City, is an image that burns into my head of just this overwhelming feeling of sadness, of how like this act of violence, even though Ozymandias will continue to say it was for the greater good, doesn't take away from what an atrocity it is. And you get the full scale of that in the comic book because it actually takes time to sit back and show you the extent as to what Ozymandias has done. In the comic book, not the comic book, in the movie, the strangest change they could ever do is make it an explosion, because that takes away the entire point of the giant squid, right? It's so bloodless. It's so instant, right? It's just takes away the entire point of Oz. It just, let me reel back a bit because I'm about to like ramble again. But in the movie, it doesn't make Ozymandias' plan so villainous, so evil, because of just how quick it is. You don't really get to step back and see the destruction that he's brought upon New York City to millions of people's lives, right? There's a difference between saying 15 million people have died and seeing 15 million people die. And that is what the movie lacks. It lacks that impact. It lacks that emotion. And honestly, it just goes back to the problems with the movie, as in it admires the characters too much. These super flawed characters. And I think Jason brought this up, where they're dressed up as Greek gods. They're treated like Greek gods.
Yeah, that's what
a lot of their flaws are. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly your point. That was a really good point. Is that they're treated more as above human in the movie.
Yeah, it feels like all of their flaws are just treated as like it's okay because they're better than everyone else and they're doing things in the greater good, so it's okay.
Exactly. In the comic, they're not depicted as gods. They are just people. They're vigilantes. They don't have superpowers, right? They just punch people or shoot people. The only real superhero is Dr. Manhattan, which we haven't got into, but that'll probably also be a 30-plus minute conversation if we talked about Dr. Manhattan. But like, all I want to say about Dr. Manhattan is that he is shown to be a godlike figure, and he's also shown to be a godlike figure in the comic as well, to an extent. In the comic, he's a godlike figure to the point where he doesn't understand humanity anymore, to the point where he just can't connect with people. And oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought because I'm still on the squid thing. But give me a few minutes.
If you want a few minutes, I was gonna ask permission to word vomit because I got
word vomit. Go ahead.
I got a gut full of words and a mind full of thoughts. It's gonna be a little bit though, so if anybody has anything pressing to get off, please go before me.
Oh, and Jake, I might cut you off, not because I'm going to say anything, but probably because I'm going to agree with whatever you're going to say.
Okay,
whatever you're going to say,
I'm probably just going to keep going
probably
when you do that.
Yeah, just do
that's
it.
That's fine. Honestly, don't get me wrong. You guys don't have to go into yours, but I think I'm going to kind of express just about everything I need to express. So consider this my final thoughts. Though again, y'all take your time. So right off the bat, I want to establish that I think Watchmen shouldn't be adapted. I don't think it is especially as a film. I think if you have to make an adaptation of this, the best option would be like a 12-episode miniseries where every episode is just an issue of the book. But even then, I think you run into the issue of like, what are you adding by changing the medium, unless you find a way for it to, because Watchmen was also a meta commentary on the medium of comics. I don't want to get into it, but there's a lot of great Alan Moore quotes about what he was hoping to liberate the comic art form past like the shackles of superheroes with this, and feels like he may have accidentally done the opposite. So unless you're going to do something like that with television, sort of, he regrets a lot of the things he made, actually. So
as many artists,
unless you're going to do something similar with the television medium, I don't really know why you need to adapt this at all. But so that being said, I think Snyder, to his credit, does like the stuff he cuts out, I think is the right stuff that you have to cut out for this to be a functioning narrative as a film at all. The problem is it's just not a story that's meant for film. Like this, and I do, to his credit, even Snyder says that. I believe I could be wrong, but I believe Snyder had the mindset of, this should never be made into a movie, but it's going to happen with or without me, so it might as well be with me. Like, and I'm paraphrasing there, and I respect that. But I do think for a few reasons he wasn't the best pick, though again I think it's an impossible task. And I don't want to get into, there's a lot of talk about Snyder's political ideology, if he's like what his affiliations are, if he's Randian, calling him an objectivist. I don't really feel the need to get into that because frankly I think a lot of that's, I see what people say through his works with that, but I think his messaging is too mixed for that to be true. And I think ultimately though, where he excels as a filmmaker is in high concept stuff. That is to say, just really like focusing on a striking and easy to communicate idea, just like good versus evil. Like the original Star Wars Episode 4 is pretty high concept. It's pretty easy of just, light side good, dark side bad, fascism bad. And I think Snyder really excels at that. The stuff of his that I really like, that worked better for me, like Army of the Dead or his Justice League cut, or even I'm like generally pretty positive on Man of Steel, is stuff that is really simple. Family is good, hope is good.
300 is also the same way as well.
Yeah, exactly. And like anything else, there's layers to it. Like I know there's a lot of criticism about the Orientalism in 300, but I'm trying in an effort to stay focused. The thing to me though is, so Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons made Watchmen, and as has been discussed very brilliantly, in my opinion, by the three of you guys all night tonight. A lot of and you guys have brought up really good examples like the sex scene or the prison stuff with Rorschach, or but like, so if anyone's not familiar, the Watchmen comic is famous for using a 9-panel grid of 9 evenly sized panels throughout for everything, and even when it doesn't stick strictly to it. And if you Google Google image Watchmen panel structure, for anyone who's listening and isn't familiar, you got a bunch of great examples of what I'm talking about. But like one example of something that's not strictly a 9-panel grid is the Veidt assassination scene, where he has the staged assassination and is not technically 9 panels there. It is like in the middle there's 2 tall panels meeting at the seam of the page, and then there's 3 like slightly longer panels on either side of it, but if you look, you could see where it comes from the 9, and they just kind of merge a couple. And that is a panel that is, the 2 pages mirror each other, and that shows you, it gives you this sense of like how much in control Veidt is of the situation, even when this assassination attempt is happening. And then upon further reread, it really adds to it when you know he's really in control of everything, and this is all staged. Whereas that is not the case at all in the assassination scene in the movie. So again, like we talked about all night tonight as we've recorded, the comic frames everything with an objective lens. Obviously not a literal lens like film, but there's objective and subjective, like when you're doing any kind of storytelling. And there's not a right or wrong, but what the comic impacts the reader by being objective is it just kind of makes you look at everything in this dispassionate view. And the violence, which is actually pretty sparse in the comic, as you guys talked about, is framed in this kind of light of like, oh, like it doesn't make it exciting or sexy. It's not glamorized or romanticized. I love the example Sean used earlier of the Hollis Mason murders. Like, don't get me wrong, and like he gets flashbacks of punching Nazis. That type of violence is probably like the one type of violence that's always okay. Love punch, never bad choice to punch Nazis. But it's so different, like glamorizing, like that communicates that the movie is taking a side that this vigilantism is good, whereas the comic book is on the opposite spectrum. And I think that comes down to, because Snyder is really good at high concept stories and also very good at visuals, as Matt's talked about. He's like just an incredibly skilled filmmaker in like all the crafty technical ways. He's really good at myth making. He's really interested in mythology, and that's something you can hear him talk about. His favorite movie of all time is Excalibur. It's even like included as an Easter egg for the movie that's playing at the theater during the Wayne murders in BVS. And that is a movie that is very, very gory. It is a more gory take on an existing myth, the way his superhero adaptations have been, and is also very interested in the myth making, but it's a lot more just clinical, like good versus evil. It doesn't get into the political spectrum like Watchmen does. It doesn't have that kind of psychological aspect. So I think when it comes down to him adapting Watchmen, he really wants to build up in the mythology, whereas the entire premise of the source material is tearing that down in an effort to again liberate the comic medium. And I think this was in a stage where like comic book movies were starting to heat up, so weirdly a Watchmen movie could have really liberated the film medium for what eventually became this onslaught of superheroes. Frankly, it didn't have that much of an impact. The movie bombed theatrically, but it does the opposite. And now, in an effort to evaluate the art on its own and not just as an adaptation, I said something similar about X3 and about Punisher Warzone, two movies with political messaging that I think it's really, really messy and that I often disagree with. I don't think my issues with Watchmen aren't that I disagree with its assessment of characters like Rorschach, someone who is objectivist, and sees the world in black and white. It's that I don't think the movie even communicates the fact, like, I don't know that the movie actually thinks that. So when I think it was Matt earlier talking about the murder of Rorschach and Night Owl, it's this grand operatic death in the movie. In the comic, he just blows him up. And like, there's a top-down shot in this of his gore making a Rorschach in the sand, in the snow. That's not there in the comic. He just does it, and it's over. And I think it's one of those things that it really sums it up well, how the movie wants you to feel for Rorschach and feel like it's this tragedy that Rorschach didn't get to really show the world the truth. It kind of does, but at the time you don't know that. Whereas in the comic, it doesn't really take a stance on that. And I think that all comes down to the end of the film versus the end of the comic as well, where the last words. Technically, there's a little quote boxes at the end of each issue of Watchmen, but the last like words is I leave it entirely in your hands, and that is a call from Moore and Gibbons to readers to one, debate like the literal story, plot sense of what do you think happens next? Do you think the world finds peace? Do you think they buy into it? Do you think this is published? But it also calls for people to open a dialogue about the morals and the ethics of this story and how that applies to the real world and about how we can achieve peace. Because ultimately, this is a really dark dystopian book, but it's about achieving peace. And there are these little moments like when Manhattan realizes like the miracle of Laurie existing, that her father is the man that tried to rape her mother, but also they loved each other. And how like that doesn't make any sense, and yet Laurie exists. And the movie kind of just seems to take the more literal, we don't know what do you think happens next plot wise. It doesn't, because of the way it frames the ending with Rorschach's death, it doesn't really seem to leave a lot of objectivity, a lot of debate, for what will happen, what should happen. And ultimately the story is a warning. Rorschach is not a hero to be idolized. That Moore has said it himself, that the people who come up to him and say like, I am Rorschach, that's my story, and I'll be thinking, yeah, great, can you just keep away from me, never come near me again as long as I live? And I think that sums it up versus this is a genuine
I love him.
This is a genuine quote. It's also like politically, Alan Moore is an anarcho-communist, like obvious. I don't know what Snyder considers himself, but I feel safe to say it's not that. This is, comparison-wise, this is a direct quote here from Zack Snyder, not necessarily somewhat about Watchmen, but not entirely. He was talking about, there's a comic called Heavy Metal, which is now kind of looked at as this high, like, I don't want to get into the history of heavy metal, especially not having read it, but it's not a child-appropriate comic. I had a buddy who tried getting me into normal comic books, but I was all like, no one is having sex or killing each other. This isn't really doing it for me. I was a little broken that way. So when Watchmen came along, I was like, this is more my scene. And I think that sums up the issue as an adaptation, and that, yes, there was violence and sex in the Watchmen comic. No, it is not mature because of that, and it is not cool, and it does not look at those things as cool necessarily. To be clear, nothing wrong with sex, but the context of the sex, as we discussed already. But whereas Zack seems to just think it's cool, which is why my end point is, if there's one thing that Zack Snyder should do, it's make a Mortal Kombat movie. Because it has mythos, it has a high concept of just good versus evil, it's violent and sexy.
What? That, you might have something there.
So, long
Get him
story
on
short,
the phone.
I'm gonna try to end it. I'm gonna try to end it here for myself, because I know that was a lot. But like for me, that is why the high. So for me, like the high point is that opening montage because I think that's where his imagery really works because it's like snapshots of the past and these idealized things. So his more like hyper posed style, which he's really good at, which works for a lot of comic book adaptations, but not this one, actually does shine because it's being looked at through a non-objective lens. It's being told as this nostalgic filter, this dangerous nostalgic filter. Whereas the low point is just Rorschach. Like the amount of people that I still see to this day. Actually, there was like a tweet going around just this past week all over comic book Twitter of someone being like, "You don't get Watchmen if you don't think Rorschach's like Rorschach is a racist. He is a homophobic. He's misogynistic. He's a fascist. He is nut." And you can sympathize for him. There's a whole backstory about his childhood being super awful, and you can see why he hates sex workers because his mom was a hooker and she was a piece of shit. Not because she was a hooker, but he doesn't understand the difference. And he's a fascinating character you could be interested in, but he's not a fucking hero. No one is. And ultimately, these characters, like Veidt sees himself as a peer for Manhattan, but he's just as much of a peer for Rorschach because they both just believe one thing is so true, and that's really mirrored in that like Ozymandias does the whole spiel about I actually did my plan 25 minutes ago, which is a great subversion of trope, and then Rorschach is like kill me so I can't tell the truth, but he's already sent the journal. So that's a great thing. Okay, I gotta stop before I keep going, but yeah, I mean I don't think the movie works, but in fairness to Snyder, I don't know that there's a way that a Watchmen movie could ever work. They're making an animated one; it's probably going to suck even worse. So I don't like it, but I admire the guy in a lot of ways as a human and as an artist, and it just sucks that what this movie has done for a lot of people's perception of Rorschach. But in isolation, that opening credits montage is the best thing he's ever done, hands down.
I mean, I don't really blame Zack Snyder specifically. I more blame DC for allowing this to happen. Because they have continuously allowed Watchmen to become this humongous franchise. Even though that goes against what Watchmen is about. Like, they glorify these characters, and people look at them and think, wow, this is really cool. And admittedly, they do watch the movie and think, wow, these characters are so cool. But they don't understand who these characters really are.
Yeah,
they don't understand. Gross. Yeah, they don't understand who these characters are and what they represent. Like, we didn't even touch on all the characters. Ozymandias is another perfect example. Like, he could be a representation of how big decisions that could cost people their lives are made by the very, very rich. Also, how he is an absolute narcissist. He admires like these leaders, pharaohs, Alexander the Great, right? And he wants to be like them. He admires them because he wants to be like them, and he takes it upon himself to be a quote-unquote leader to make the necessary sacrifice. But as not depicted in the movie, unfortunately, he is alone. The not Black Sabbath comic book, the Black Freighter comic book, I feel like talks about Ozymandias, as in he sees this great evil upon them, and in order to prevent it, performs all kinds of atrocities. But by the time he gets to the end, he realizes he is just as monstrous and dangerous as the Black Freighter itself. And I feel like that's an accurate representation of what Ozymandias is going through. Because our last frame of Ozymandias in the comic is him by himself, looking distressed, wondering and pondering, or the same thing, but pondering whether he made the right decision or not. And I feel like that's a brilliant representation of what his character is. Incredibly flawed, realistic, and in the end, a monster, which is not what we get in the movie. Because in the movie, he's depicted as this calculating, absolutely brilliant leader, right? They do show these like shortcomings here and there, but they make him more as this brilliant mastermind rather than this narcissist who took it upon himself to kill millions of people for the quote-unquote greater good. And we didn't even talk about him, and yet I'm able to ramble about like 5 minutes about like one specific scene about Ozymandias. And this is the entire movie, and we didn't even get to Dr. Manhattan yet either. We didn't even talk about the gosh, I was about to call him the Joker. God damn it. It's I'm losing it. The comedian. Not the Joker, the comedian. We didn't even talk about the comedian yet. The Watchmen is just too dense, and just kind of goes back to what Jake was talking about before. The comic has too much to tell, and it is impossible for any type of medium to give this story the proper adaptation it deserves, because it is something that can only exist in comic books. And honestly, it should stay that way. And when Jake told me that there was going to be an animated show about it, I want to cry. Because there's going to be another generation of Watchmen fans who are just misled, because there's no way this animated show can properly tell Watchmen as Watchmen.
It's a 2-part movie, so it's probably going to be like sub 3 hours total. And yeah.
God damn. Oh, okay. Well, my day's ruined.
Well,
anyway, I guess that'll be my recommendation. Don't watch it. Read the comic. It's like $20. Watchmen is very cheap. It's one of the most accessible comic books in the entire market. Just go buy it.
Fair enough. Well, I guess I'll give my final thoughts.
I guess we're closing it out.
I don't really have much else to say other than my final thoughts, so I guess I will. What was my favorite part of this movie? Well, Bob Dylan is definitely a way to hook me into a movie. I'm quite the fan of Bob Dylan. I actually immediately texted Jake that and said it's off to a great start with the Bob Dylan song. Little did I know that I was not going to enjoy the rest of the movie. No, I mean, I enjoyed parts of it. I didn't hate it. The best part was probably, the introduction, as boring as that is. But it's true, it was beautiful, and it's great song. So, I mean, yeah, anyone who, if you've never listened to Bob Dylan, I'd urge you to. It's great. My least favorite part was just listening to fucking goddamn Rorschach drone on about stupid fucking Ben Shapiro-ass shit for like half the movie. And I also didn't like the Black Freighter stuff. It was fine, but it just kind of was like confusing for me at first, and then like, I don't know. I don't know. I didn't read the comic book, so I don't fucking know. Maybe it would have made more sense to me if I had, but I didn't, so I don't know. And I don't recommend the movie because it wasn't that good, and it was really fucking long.
I guess I'll give my thoughts. We'll let Jake go last because he's a weenie. I guess, yeah, my favorite part, the introduction. It's great. We've said all we could about it, honestly. I think it's really good. My least favorite part, definitely the characterization of just almost all the characters, honestly. When, again, it's one of those things where I compare this movie too much, and for me it's really hard to separate it from the comic book itself, having read the comic book second, I guess, because I initially watched the movie when I was littler, more that I saw it in clips and scenes without seeing the full thing until later, but like, I can't go back and not compare it now. It just becomes really difficult. But I guess to like kind of to sum up my final thoughts of like what I kind of like wrote down after I saw it was like, do I consider this a good adaptation? No. Do I consider this a good film? No. I do consider that like as an adaptation, it should be supplementary to the material that it's adapting. And the film does make me feel and relive like some genuinely integral parts to the comic, and does in a great way. I think the actors kind of like really do bring out like a lot of it, like just the acting from the scene where Rorschach dies, I think is great, not in that it's like the outcome is good or the way that it's shot is well done, but it's Jack Earl Haley as Rorschach, right?
Yes,
I love
the
way that he rips off his mask and just tells Dr. Manhattan to do it. Like, I love that. I love the way that makes me feel. It feels like that. It just taking that part feels perfectly like ripped from the comics. But like, yeah, in the end, a lot of the themes and the messaging are replaced and wholly taken out of context when it comes to the film. It really twists and kind of destroys how I view the film, and it's just really no different here from any other adaptation that kind of twists its message from what it's originally adapting. So like, it just, in the end, it becomes really hard for me to separate. And when I try to separate it, I like the film to a degree, although it's an interesting and very messy film to me, taking out any context of understanding the comic. But as soon as I consider that it's an adaptation and how much it misses the point of some of the most integral themes of the comic, I really just don't find it.
Yeah, I feel like it's impossible to not compare it to the comic book because it is Watchmen. Also, there's so much dialogue taken straight out of the comic that I feel like it's impossible to not compare the two. Because if you share a title and if 90% of your dialogue is ripped straight from the comic book, then you're going to get compared to. It's just inevitable.
So you don't recommend it. End of story.
Oh, I think my thoughts before made it very clear I don't recommend this movie.
Is that all she wrote, I guess?
So I guess that's a faux for faux, not recommending.
We have a hall of him, right? What's the opposite of that? We make like a hall of shit.
I was about to say hall.
Because I want to unduck this.
That's too negative.
As many movies as we bag on here, I try my best to keep it positive.
As much as I love
no.
being negative,
here's the thing. This movie has so many fundamental flaws that we didn't. We skimmed through the entire plot because we just wanted to talk about our grievances with this film. 2, we didn't even talk about the acting in this movie, and it was pretty good.
Ackerman.
Like Jackie Haley. Jackie Haley is a fantastic Rorschach. We didn't mention that at all because of how flawed fundamentally this movie is, and how it doesn't get its own source material. And in fact, there is so much shit in this shit pie that I didn't even bring up this article I found from a Zack Snyder interview in 2008, and your head's gonna fling back. So this was an article from Entertainment Weekly, and it basically was a question about how movies at the time were making superheroes more grim and gritty, and then they're talking about how it's going to work in Watchmen's favor. And Zack Snyder's response was, everybody says that about Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. Batman's dark. I'm like, okay, no, Batman's cool. He gets to go to a Tibetan monastery and be trained by ninjas. Okay, I want to do that, but he doesn't get like the R word in prison. Yeah, he said that. That could happen in my movie. If you want to talk about dark, that's how that would go. I believe that pop culture is just like so ready for Watchmen. I'm cringing while I'm reading this. We tried so hard to ride that wave between satire and reality and all the things that make you still care about the character, but you don't miss the commentary about them. Night Owl is Batman. The guy has a freaking cave under his house. No doubt a fanboy will look at this movie and not get it. He looks just like Batman. Precisely. When people saw our vision of Ozymandias' costume on the internet, some were like, it's like a Joel Schumacher Batman movie. The costume has nipples. That's crazy. And I'm like, yeah, that's the point. With their comic, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were saying superheroes are kind of funky, aren't they? We build upon that with a movie that acknowledges that superhero movies have affected pop culture. Yeah.
I have a lot of things I could say, but...
Actual response from the director of Watchmen. So you could kind of understand the disconnect between the movie and the comic book. Now, this was from 2008. I just want to show you his mentality at the time and how that has resulted in the film that we have so many grievances with. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents on it. But yeah, I guess it's a 4 for 4, thumbs down. Whether we dislike it or hate it, it kind of ranges. My hate is burning hot, and I hate this movie for all eternity. If I had a physical copy of this movie, I would burn it. Despite me loving physical media, I hate this movie that much. But anyway, thank you to @AlloFet for the art
Alo.
and
Still
Allo
Alo.
for the
Never hasn't been
YouTube
Alo.
art. God damn it.
Alo.
Allo?
Alo.
AlloFet?
Alo.
Alo.
Hello.
Thank you to AloFet for the art, and Alo now has a YouTube channel as well, Alo Ren. Yes! So go check that out as well.
Alo Ren is spelled
And Jason plugging your music?
ALOWREN, Matt, because that's someone may not know from hearing.
That's a good point.
You fool. Yeah, I made the intro, outro music. I'm making music. It's gonna be out. I'm working on it. I'm working tirelessly. Trust. The Upsides PA on Instagram, the _Upsides PA on Twitter, the Upsides on SoundCloud.
Alright, so if you want to listen to us ramble and waste more of your time, you can find us on whatever platform you get your podcast from, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, Culture Illiterate Podcast. You can also follow us on the socials if you're like that. And you can reach out to us through our email, cultureilliterate.pod@gmail.com.
Hey, Matt,
because we
what's the
suck. We know.
Who knows?
It's illiterate_pod on Twitter, Instagram, and more stuff that I don't care about. Anyway, so next episode we can sit back discussing something much more less dense.
Read it, buddy. What is it?
X-Men Origins Wolverine.
Oh, yes.
Let's go.